Hello everybody, thanks for attending the webinar today. Today we're going to be going through targeted TSS for Ironman training. We've got Gordo Byrne, founder of Endurance Corner, and Alan Cousins, exercise physiologist and coach at Endurance Corner, joining us. So before we get started, I'm just going to cover off on a little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions as we go through the presentation, feel free to ask them. There's a little questions area where you can type in your question. And I'm going to be answering questions, and Kelly Bays from TrainingPeaks is also going to be answering questions. We will hold some questions for the end. So we've asked Gordo and Alan to save some time to answer questions that come through. And there's a chance we may not get to everybody's questions, but we're going to try as hard as we can to go through all of them. Also, this webinar is great information. It's full of a lot of really, really good stuff. And what we're planning on doing is having a follow-up webinar to this, where I'm going to be taking everyone who attends through a TrainingPeaks account and showing them how to use TSS and how to use a performance management chart, more from a TrainingPeaks feature aspect. So keep your eyes open for that, because that should be coming in the next couple weeks. And finally, before we get started, I'm just going to show you a couple places in your TrainingPeaks account. So when Gordo and Alan are talking, you have a little bit better idea of where you would access that feature in your TrainingPeaks account. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So you should be seeing my TrainingPeaks homepage right now. I'll log into my account, and one of the things that you may be asking yourself is, when you do a workout, where do you see the TSS scores for that workout? So if I load up one of these workouts, this is a run. I go to my stats tab, and here you're going to see the score. You're going to see the intensity factor. If it's a cycling workout, you're going to see the TSS for that bike. And this is a workout where a power meter was used, so that data was uploaded. So just to show you where you access that information for a workout in the TrainingPeaks account. And then finally, if you want to know where you access the performance management chart, that's on your dashboard. And this is just, it's not a great chart, but this is an example of what a performance management chart looks like. So it's just a chart that you drag and drop onto your dashboard. Okay, so with that being said, now I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Gordo.
Thanks. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to chat you through the key terms to give you a bit of background in terms of what you need to understand TSS. And then we're also going to share some data with you so that you can understand kind of how you can target TSS and give you tips for managing your own TSS. We're also going to give you some, from our experience, give you some things that you want to watch out for. And finally, we're going to share some actual data in our experience for the whole performance range, as well as we've got a really nice chart that Alan put together for a guy that's on our team who is very experienced as well as very speedy, multiple Kona qualifier, to give you an idea of what it might take for a multi-year progression of training load to take yourself up to the top of your age group. And now I'm going to, maybe before I hand it over to Alan, we'll give you a little bit of background on us, because I imagine everybody on the call might not be familiar with us. I'll open up. So I'm Gordo, and my background is I did my first Ironman in 1999, and since then I've probably done, I haven't counted them all up recently, but say about 16 Ironmans. And I've probably coached over 300 athletes through various Ironmans. I've worked with people, elite athletes, all the way through to people that are trying to get through their first Ironman. I probably have the most experience working with folks that are trying to qualify for Kona and have a full-time job at the same time. So kind of real-world elite amateur performance. We've had a lot of success with that within our team. Different age groups, men, women, younger athletes, and older athletes. With my own racing, managed to get myself fast enough to finish second at a couple Ironmans, never quite won them. Managed to win a race called Ultraman Hawaii over on the Big Island, which is a 3-day triathlon. AC, over to you.
Alrighty. I'm Alan. At the moment, I'm one of the coaches for Endurance Corner. And like Gordo, I devote most of my waking hours, I guess, to working with top age group athletes. I'm also the exercise physiologist for the team, so do a lot of testing, things like that. My background is in elite swim coaching in Australia. I did my master's degree in exercise physiology at the University of Western Sydney, and just kind of progressed from there. First of all, through the elite swim coaching kind of ranks, and decided that 4 a.m. starts weren't the best routes. I moved into triathlon coaching, and now spend my days working with some of the best age group athletes in the country, training them.
Okay, let's get stuck in.
Alrighty. So we'll start with just a quick definition of the terms. I guess I'm sort of assuming that the folks interested in a webinar on TSS are already somewhat savvy, but just a quick kind of rehash of some of the key terms associated with TSS and with performance modeling. First, the big day term is the training stress score, which is a score devised by Andy Coggan that basically rolls the volume of a workout and the intensity into one number. So we can start to compare things like, you know, an hour training session at threshold. How does that compare to a 6-hour long Ironman specific ride? So it's a very useful term, especially for the population that we deal with who do you know, long sessions, short sessions that run the whole gamut. The formula, the simplified formula, is the intensity factor squared times 100 times the duration in hours, and we'll talk a little bit about intensity factor and some of the associated terms in a minute.
And just before we move on, just one thing that I want to highlight is metabolic cost. And I think that's an important concept. So when you're looking at your own TSS, really what it's trying to capture is metabolic cost. And AC, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and you know, it can lead to a little bit of confusion because you have some folks who feel that a workout might be harder, but have a lower TSS score. So it's important to sort of understand what we're trying to approximate with TSS. And basically what we're looking at is the glycogen cost of the workout. So in energy store terms, how much did you expend in doing that workout? It's not going to take into account things like how much muscular damage was done. You know, we'll talk a little bit about some of the caveats that are associated with the concept. But basically, the best way to think about it is how much carbohydrate did you expend during the workout, and consequently, how long is it going to take you to replace that carbohydrate and recover and get back to the point that you can do another hard workout.
Excellent. Okay.
Alrighty, so we talked a little bit about intensity factor. That is quite simply the normalized power of the training session divided by your functional threshold power. So if your functional threshold is 300 and the normalized power from your session was 200,
we're talking watts for the bike here.
Correct. Then the intensity factor would be 0.67, I guess. So it's a really easy way of kind of looking at it on a percentage level, how close to that threshold number you were. We talked about normalized power in that above term. Normalized power, which is really kind of the basic unit of the whole TSS structure, is a weighted average power that better reflects what Gordo was talking about, the metabolic cost of the workout. So if we compare two workouts, one where you're on the flat in the aero position, just pushing out a constant 200 watts, and another one where every minute you vary, you go 300 watts and then you back it off to 0 and coast, both of those workouts will have an average power of 200 watts, but the one with the variability will have a much greater metabolic cost. And if you want to experiment with it, then go ahead and try those two workouts. But I think you'll agree with the difference between those two.
And another way to look at it, if you don't have a technical background, just a simple way to look at it is if you think about, look, what's the average of the workout if I just got rid of all the zeros? And it's a gross oversimplification, but if you're not used to dealing with square roots and cubes and things and all that, and you just want to think, okay, if it's a hilly ride, it's sort of what was my uphill power, assuming I was pretty much coasting downhill. Likewise, if it's a ride where you're in a group where it's highly variable, it's what's my average when I'm putting power through the pedals. And I think that's a simple way for somebody that might not be used to the mathematics to understand that.
Yeah, if you don't have a head unit that shows normalized power, then that can be a really useful way of sort of getting an approximation of what the normalized is going to be after you download the work.
And then yeah, that's just a little something to tell people too. So if on your power meter you set it to record averages without zeros, then the average you're going to look at will be pretty close to normalized. Likewise, if you use interval function for your main sets, and those intervals are being recorded without zeros, they'll come pretty close to normalized. So if your coach or yourself, if you're self-coached, if you're giving yourself a normalized type target that you're shooting for, you can look at that average that way. And now with the more sophisticated head units, they will actually calculate your normalized power for you.
Yeah,
I think
Garmin does that.
Garmin does it. Okay.
There's been a new updates.
Okay.
Alrighty, so functional threshold power, the number on which all of this is based is simply your best hour of power. It's your best normalized hour of power, I should probably say. We'll talk a little bit about that, and Gordo will go into some things to look for there.
So a couple cautions. First off, generally, Alan and I have worked with hundreds of athletes, and what do you think, what percentage of athletes when they come to you would have an accurate assessment of their threshold power? What do you think?
I think less than 5%,
yeah,
quite honestly.
Less than 5%. And it's about the same for me. So pretty much 90 to 95% of the athletes, when we start working with them, have overestimated their functional threshold power. Why is that? Well, there's a couple reasons. First is we all want to look as strong as possible. So we tend to convince ourselves that our thresholds are higher than they actually are. How do we do that? Well, we tend to use short values and short duration values. So best 5-minute pace, best 20-minute power, and then we apply formulas to extend that to a 60-minute. Now, one of the nice things about TrainingPeaks is you can go in and you can look at, well, what is the actual best hour of power that I did in the last 3 months or 6 months or 12 months. Likewise, you can go in and look at what's my best pace for running, 10-minute, 20-minute, half-hour, 40-minute. And you can compare that to where you're setting your FTP, your functional threshold pace or power. It's very important for this analysis that you're setting an accurate threshold. Because if you're overestimating your threshold, what that will mean is that your intensity factor is understated. And you'll be giving yourself far more stress than you realize. Likewise, if you're a coach and you have an athlete where it might make your athlete happy if you set the threshold high, but you're going to absolutely crush them if you use appropriate training zones with a FTP that's set too high. So that's the second bullet point there, reality checks. Always check against your season high critical power and critical pace values. The other thing is, we're talking about Ironman today, and Ironman is somewhere between an 8 and 17-hour event. So remember, you're seeking to optimize your race performance, not your functional threshold performance. It's because you can optimize yourself for 20 to 60-minute events and not be prepared at all for an Ironman event. So,
and I should add too that the things that you're going to do to optimize your CP5 or CP20 are the absolute opposite of what you want to do in preparing for an Ironman. You know, there are things like if you sharpen, if you improve your ability to handle lactate, then you're going to come up with a great CP5 or CP20, and you're going to blow your season. So I think, you know, it's important not to train for those efforts.
Don't train for your testing.
Yeah.
Accept, and that's a great thing, accept your fitness, accept your functional threshold, and you're just going to use it to plug it in for your overall view. And we're going to come on and we'll give you an example of what, you know, you're going to look like for your season. The other thing, you know, FTP, I made a little acronym. Is that the right word? Yeah. Field testing prevails. If you go into the lab and you're ramping yourself up at 3-minute steps, and all of a sudden somebody says your breathing or your lactate hits a magic number, that's great. That might be a useful starting point. But until you can go out and put it down for 40 to 60 minutes and prove that functional threshold value, it doesn't count. And so remember, the field performance is what you want to weight very heavily. Final thing is, what I found is this, the TSS tracking and your training stress balance and all these different terms that you're going to get and that you can use for within the TrainingPeaks system and within the WKO Plus software. It's most helpful to learn your personal red zone. In other words, when you might be getting yourself into trouble. And it's not that great for comparing between athletes. For instance, Alan and I, if you look at our threshold values on the bike, very similar. Our curves look the same. When we're fit, our lactate curves look very similar. However, the training stress that each of us can handle is very different. And if Alan used my curve or my load, or vice versa, it wouldn't be appropriate. So this stuff is most useful for comparing against yourself, not comparing with your buddies. And it's really tough to resist the urge to train amongst friends and stuff. But remember, ultimately, what you're trying to optimize is your own race day performance. Final point, and AC is going to come on to that later in terms of what do I do when life intervenes. You can't capture your life stress in this system. It doesn't do it. It's based on the work that you do in training. It's going to pull it down off your, off your Joule or off your Garmin, and it's going to give you a number. If you've got stuff going on at work, you're not sleeping right, it's going to skew your normal situation, and you just need to be aware of that. Different things will impact you. So you're going to need to be mentally flexible with that. AC will come on to that. So over to you, Miko.
Righty. Slide. So with those cautions, I guess, in mind, you may be asking yourself, why do we want to use TSS then to target your training? Why do we want to use TSS prescriptively? And the major two reasons are, number one, I guess the old-fashioned way of looking at training load, at least in Ironman kind of circles, is to look at training volume. So people will talk in terms of, I did a 30-hour training week this week. I did a 40-hour training week if you're a little crazier. But volume only tells part of the story. I can kind of attest to this in looking at these numbers for a long period of time now. There are some athletes who do very well at Ironman on relatively low training volumes. If we look at the hour number, we've got guys who are podium finishing in that 10 to 15 hour per week range in terms of volume. If we dig a little deeper and look at their actual training load and the intensity that's going along with that volume, then the numbers start to line up a little bit more, and it starts to make a little bit more sense. So it's always important to look at those things in context. Looking at volume alone is not going to tell you the full story in terms of the training load that the athlete is doing. There's guys who are doing 1,000 TSS on 12 hours a week, and then there's other guys who are doing it on 24. So it's really important to look at the intensity of the sessions as well, and that's something that TSS, because it incorporates an intensity factor, it does. The second reason that we want to use TSS to target Ironman training, and the thing that really gets me excited and gets the AC juices flowing, is TSS opens the door to this wonderful world of performance modeling. And we'll go into that in a little bit more depth, but basically what I'm talking about there is through things like the performance management chart, which you can see on TrainingPeaks. It's very, very easy to get a global sense of what's going on with your fitness and your fatigue at any point in time. And training stress and inputting correct training stress is kind of the first step in terms of getting that big picture of what's going on with your training and with your fitness and fatigue. So let's move ahead on that one. So going into performance modeling in a little bit more depth, as a coach, an athlete comes to me and they say, Coach, my goal is X, Y, Z. I want to qualify for Kona. I want to get onto the podium of an international Ironman race, whatever the case might be. And my job then is to look at that athlete and look at their past training history, kind of get a sense of what type of athlete they are, what how they adapt to the training load, and make the call of what sort of training is it going to take to get this athlete to achieve the goals they've come to me for. And performance modeling, really, it ties in fantastically well with that question of, I want to reach a certain level of fitness. How am I going to get there? And another way of looking at it is input versus response. So for each athlete, they're going to have a different training response to a given input. So when we're talking about input here, we're talking about training stress. So my job is to start to look at that fitness that the athlete's getting from a given training input and start to identify trends. So we might say, we know a particular athlete, they qualify for Kona when their CTL reaches 120. So we then start to kind of work back from there and identify a plan to get the athlete to that point. And TSS enables us to sort of quantify that.
And just before we move on, just because we use a few technical terms there. So you said a CTL of 120. That's 120 TSS points per day average over what type of period?
So it's an exponentially weighted average is what CTL is. If we look at it, say, over a 5-month period, you'll get very, very close to that CTL number if that's your average per day. So if we were targeting a CTL of 100, if you did 100 TSS per day over the course of 5 months, you would be pretty much there. You'd be 80% of the way in 3 months. So that's where the exponential weighting of it comes in, and that's something that's important to look at because we're talking about fairly long periods of time here. We're talking about a season basically. So it's really important that you have a realistic expectation of what you think that CTL is going to cap out at. If realistically it's going to be 100, then there's no point training 200 TSS a day for one period of time.
And this is something that I just want to look at this. The sooner you start capturing your data for as much of your training as possible, the better, because you've got the ability to go to a coach that understands it, or even consult with a coach that understands it, somebody who's a real expert, and then go in, look at what's going on and talk to you about the data. So even if you're listening out there, and this is all new to you, if you just start saving your data while you're learning, it'll be very valuable to you, because the more seasons and months that you have, the better. And you'll see why when we come onto the charts. The good news with TrainingPeaks is, the data that I uploaded 10 years ago is still sitting there. So, you don't need to worry about your data when you change machines or do whatever. It's just going to be sitting on the server, and that's a nice service that's offered.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, if an athlete comes to me and they don't have data, maybe they've been training with power but only kind of looking at the head unit, not really recording any sessions, then it takes me a year or so to really get a good sense of how that athlete's responding to training. So, as Gordo said, even if you don't really understand everything right now, just collect the data, and eventually, I can assure you there'll be a point where you'll be chatting with someone and they'll be pretty happy that you started collecting that a long time ago.
And we're seeing on TrainingPeaks, I mean, the system, every season, the automatic stuff that it can throw up gets better and better. So as long as the data's in there, you can just let the software do it for you.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go into this chart here.
Alrighty, so kind of still on that question of why use TSS to target your training, I've prepared a chart here of the guys that I coached in the 2011 season one-on-one. So I coached 15 guys at a time one-on-one. And what this chart shows is their Ironman performance versus their peak CTL. So we've got...
That's the highest point they hit during the year?
Right, highest point that they hit. So, you know, if we looked at a race day CTL, typically it will come down a little bit as the athlete tapers. But you know, the main point of this chart is that there's a pretty good relationship between CTL and Ironman performance. You know, and Ironman performance it in itself is not a very consistent variable. We've got courses from, you know, Coeur d'Alene, Kona, Switzerland, a whole bunch of courses. You know, the relationship that's showing is pretty good. I mean, you know, I guess it's up to everyone to make up their mind as to whether it's significant enough to want to apply to your training. But you know, I think this alone, without kind of, you know, taking into account all the different courses and the amount of climbing in the courses, you know, that sort of thing, it shows that if your CTL goes up, typically your Ironman performance will improve.
Just a question for me. It looks like there's a cluster kind of in that 120 to 160 range.
Yeah.
Did all those athletes qualify for Kona?
Maybe not the 120 guy.
Okay, but most.
Yeah, most of those guys. So yeah, I mean that's typically who I'm dealing with, and that's typically where the training load of most of my guys is.
So you got, I mean, ballpark. The closer you can get to 140 type CTL, the better you're looking. If you're, you know, you're trying to get that slot.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think that's true. I was saying 130, but it seems like it's getting more and more competitive every year. So
well, and the slots are thinning out. I mean,
yeah,
I mean, you got to be, you know, you got to be in shape to podium. I mean, realistically, and then maybe you get a roll down or something. But yeah, it's definitely tightening up. Okay, let's go on to this. This next chart is really good. I like it. So there we go.
Yeah, this kind of takes it to another level and looks at one particular athlete that I've worked with over quite a few years now, and looks at the relationship between the athlete's CTL and how their performance has progressed. So you can see, but before coming to me, that he actually prepared this table, which I thought was pretty cool. It you know, kind of showed the whole long-term progression. But before starting with me, he was kind of on the verge of you know, Kona qualifying. He had it in his sights, but hadn't really kind of put together the optimal race to get to that point. And when we started working together, that was objective number one. And going into Ironman Arizona, you can see his CTL was around about the 100 mark, and that was actually his first qualifying race. He went 10:15 with that CTL, and got a roll down slot, I believe. So then moving along, had another breakthrough performance in Florida that year. Went 9:23, got 10th in his age group. That was his fastest race to date, and you can see his CTL was 120, maybe a little over 120 at that point. Went to Hawaii, you know, had that kind of first experience in Hawaii and learned a few things with the determination to go back. Moving along, 2009, similar kind of CTL, similar kind of relative performance. Went 9:39 in Arizona, 14th, not enough for a Kona slot at that point. Next season, 10:04, we got third, his first podium slot. That was a challenging race, very warm day in Kentucky that year, and he did that podiumed with a CTL almost at 140. So that's where we're headed. That was a breakthrough year.
And just a couple things that stand out here too. So this is on this is on a very sort of fine-tuned program. The other thing that strikes me is you obviously have a very highly motivated athlete. And for the people looking at the chart out there, look at how much the CTL drops in the transition part of the season. So that's an important thing, is you need to be willing to let yourself, in effect, get out of shape. But likewise, although that CTL is falling off, it's still roughly equivalent to peak shape earlier in that athlete's career. So there's still an element of consistent training, but the athlete's form and fitness, you're going to feel like you're out of shape during that period. And I think that's an important thing to remember, is that if you want to take yourself up towards the limits of what you're going to be able to handle in terms of load, you're going to need to cycle that load over some very long periods. So like those peak to trough, what do you think? Is that like 6 months typically?
Yeah, so we had a couple of kind of double peak years where you'd have one peak in 6 months, and then you had a couple in there that were single peak years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, that's a really good point, you know, and that's something that, again, kind of going back to what the software does, it will show you another number that we won't talk about quite so much in this presentation of ATL, or acute training load, and that's the fatigue component of performance. So it's, from my perspective and in working with athletes over multi-year periods, it's really, really important to get that ATL number down close to zero. And, you know, it'll obviously depend on the athlete. We want to keep them moving, but, you know, get down 20, 30, maybe 40 ATL before starting the next season. The athletes who don't do that, who hold on to, you know, 50, 60% of their ATL, are the ones who tend to plateau and don't reach that higher level of performance in the next season.
And that's a great term, plateau, and you're gonna and you will see that. So there's a lot of good athletes out there that are unable to reach their maximum performance, that are close to getting that slot, and they're never able to take themselves to the next level. And if you find that you're plateaued, you might simply be not giving yourself room to kind of go past that plateau in the transition part of your season. So right now, in the Northern Hemisphere, you know, we got snow on the ground outside, daylight short, people are kind of going crazy. You can get a little stir crazy. You don't want to ramp that load too quickly. You need to give yourself room so that you can be building all the way up, and ideally get that maximum CTL. It's probably going to peak, say, 2 weeks out from the event, or, you know,
depending on the athlete.
Depends on the athlete, but you know, you got to be thinking, I'm going to be building this whole season. Not get yourself to the point where you're kind of maxed out March, April, and then you're just going to go flat and try and hang on for the year.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, there's a lot of athletes who are training solid the year round, but the ones who are doing the sort of thing that this athlete is doing, train really, really easy for periods of time, and then really, really hard for periods of time. And that kind of that dichotomy is something that's really important to kind of getting to that next level.
So the next chart is there you go. So that, what are we looking at here?
So looking at the relationship that we had on that other chart between CTL and Ironman performance, I prepared a table based on that regression formula that came from that chart, so that, you know, again, this is a small kind of number of folks, you know, 15 athletes at any one time, but you know, the correlation coefficient was pretty good at 0.72, and again, you know, we're talking about Ironman performance. We're not talking about more stable indicators of fitness here. So I'm pretty happy with that. I'm kind of surprised that it correlates as well as it does. But basically, what we've got here is you can look and say, well, if you know, if my goal is say a Kona slot this year, which is, you know, these days on a flat course taking 9:30 for a youngish guy. You know, that equates to a CTL, like what I was saying, in that 140 range. So, you know, it puts those things in perspective and kind of enables you to answer that question. You know, if I'm looking at a CTL of 140, then I'm going to be doing a whole lot of weeks at 140 TSS a day. You know, we said it takes about 5 months to manifest that kind of CTL. So we're talking about, I don't know, 20 weeks of your year in a relatively, you know, short period of time at 140 TSS a day. So what's that? Almost 1,100 TSS a week. So when you start kind of working with these terms a little bit, you'll see that an 1,100 TSS week is a pretty solid week.
And Alan's prepared some training plans that can help you get a feel for, well, how would that type of TSS break down swim, bike, and run? And those are in the...
Yep, yeah, I've got, we'll talk a little bit about those. I've prepared some sample plans at the moment that you can check out under my name in the TrainingPeaks store in the plan section. And basically, the nature of them is, okay, my CTL is here, so plug this plan in order to get your CTL to the next level. That's kind of how it's structured.
And seeing as we're talking about targeted TSS, CTL, there's a couple of things you want to be paying attention to, just kind of pitfalls and things like that. If you hit the wall and all of a sudden that CTL starts dropping when you want it to go up, you need to pay attention to that. In other words, you got to look at what did it take to crack you, because you don't want to go back there. In other words, it's a sign that you went a little too far, a little too fast, and you want to look at what caused that. And your training, there's something called your training stress balance. And if you took yourself into a very big hole, so your TSB became very negative, look at the number where you got sick, where you were unable to complete the plan, and learn from that. And as you start approaching that number, know that you're going into the red zone or the danger zone. And that's a great way to use the software to prevent yourself from getting sick or going over the edge, because we're all going to have a magic number where we will consistently crack. That's something that both Alan and I see. I see it within myself. And once you know that, you know you're in the danger zone, and it's a temporary place to be. You're going to have to back off real soon, or your body will just get sick and you won't be able to train.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point in terms of seeing the CTL drop. It's very similar to the late stages of an Ironman race. They say that if you pass during the late stages of an Ironman race, then it's usually a permanent pass. It's kind of tough to come back from that. It's the same sort of thing. If you see your CTL start to drop towards the end of the season, then it's very tough to build it back to that peak level. So that's something that you want to look at in terms of peaking for race, in terms of kind of planning how hard you're going to train and when you're going to train hard. Something that we see with camps. It takes a few of us.
Absolutely. No, that's the classic one. The early season spring camp. Yep. Basically, 2 weeks after that, an athlete's gone into it. They treated it like a 6-day stage race. They've completely crushed themselves in all their competition, but that's it. The CTL is maxed, and they're going to struggle for the rest of the year. And it takes uncommon discipline to go into the camp and say, actually, I'm not going to max it out. It's an early season camp. I got to leave myself room to keep going up for that. And that's something to bear in mind. Similar thing, if you live someplace where you're going to be weather constrained until April, or even May, if you're up in Canada, you need to be careful in those early weeks that you don't just go bananas and ramp yourself too far too quick. So great. Okay. I think we can probably roll through that one.
Yep. Just one point on this one, significantly better fit than annual volume alone. So we talked a little bit about comparing TSS versus hours. And the reason is, first of all, the impact of intensity, which we talked about. And the second, it's not just about volume, it's about volume plus timing. So that's something we were talking about with the camps and with planning when you're going to do those overload periods. Because, if you do big weeks in February, then it's going to look great in terms of the average hours for the year, but if we look at your actual CTL, we'll probably see that it actually peaked pretty close to February and then went down. So that the timing of the load is very important, and that's something that the Performance Manager chart shows.
And just before I get into this one, just because it's related to this, one of the things for those of you out there, if you're a very experienced athlete versus somebody that's a newer athlete, and one of the things is, what I've found is that CTL is showing, in a sense, it's your capacity to do work. For a very experienced athlete, it starts to become a little bit more towards the ATL, the acute load that you can put into yourself, specifically the very specific Ironman prep days or prep weekend. And a workout that we like to do on the team might be a broken Ironman over, say, a long weekend with a very experienced athlete. Now, that type of workout might not necessarily appear in the overall CTL graph, but your capacity to do a lot of work within 24 hours or 48 hours is also a very specific type of fitness. So when I'm looking at it with myself, I mean, I've been doing Ironman for a really long time. One of the things that I want to be heading towards as I'm coming into a race is the capacity to do very specific, more work rate type training. But your CTL, the total work that you can do, will show you how much room you have to do that more work rate training. And one of the things that Alan and I like to say is work before work rate. So prove your capacity to do the work, build that CTL before you start doing your really race-specific training. Because your capacity to recover from your challenging training, that CTL will give you a good indication of kind of where you're at. For instance, a big day, if you've got a 50 CTL, is way bigger than if you've got 140 CTL. Okay, so I just wanted to toss that concept out there. Now, one of the things I found when I look at the TSS number, and that's why I wanted to say it's about the metabolic cost. We touched on that earlier. We're not going to rehash it, but it's not capturing a couple things. So the TSS that I can throw up on the bike is pretty impressive because I have really good metabolic fitness compared to the average athlete. So if you look at, say, my TSS number, you'd say, wow, he's going to be totally wrecked. Well, not really, because the system and the formula thinks I'm under more metabolic stress than I am. In other words, I can utilize fat for fuel better than average. And that metabolic fitness gives me an edge versus the system. Now, that's why I got to compare relative to myself, because I might be flattered relative to averages, but we know that I can do these larger things. So compare it relative to yourself. Also, Alan mentioned earlier, we're going to reiterate it, it doesn't capture muscular damage. And if you're used to just doing flat, soft surface runs, and we take you out in the local foothills here in Boulder, and we run you up and down hill, or we do a loop that we like to do where you run you down Sunshine Canyon, hard surface, 5K downhill at the end of an hour 45 run, it's not your TSS isn't going to capture the fact that your legs are going to be completely destroyed if you're not used to that. So that's something to bear in mind. You might just shell yourself with muscular damage. The other thing for age groupers, particularly average mid-pack age groupers, or somebody that doesn't come from a swimming background, there's certain assumptions with your swim TSS that won't apply if your economy is not particularly good. And in other words, if you're the type of swimmer that really has two speeds, swimming and holding onto the wall. If you're sort of a one-speed or a two-speed type swimmer, you're going to get very fatigued from swimming, probably more tired than the TSS might give you credit for. And you just need to be aware of that because triathlon, swim, bike, run, you're going to have to manage between the muscular damage from the running, the fact that your swimming might make you really tired. Likewise, if you're a really efficient swimmer, if you come from an elite swim background, you're going to be able to do a lot of aerobic work in the water that's not going to be all that tiring, and that can give you an edge. And then finally, the final point is unable to capture life stress. And so if your blue line starts dropping, your CTL starts dropping, and you have a life stress event, you'll know that that might be it, and you'll need to adjust your plan accordingly. Okay.
Alrighty, so moving on to how we use this number now that we've talked about to target a performance goal, or how do we get to a given CTL? We looked on that table at the sort of numbers that you may want to be kind of heading towards depending on your goals. Two ways basically to do it, constant load versus constant ramp rate. So constant load says that if I want my CTL to be 140, then I'm going to go out and I'm going to train 140 TSS a day, every day for 5 months. That would be one way to do it. It wouldn't be my recommended way to do it because when you're starting from zero, 140 TSS a day is pretty stressful. So as Gordo was saying, it's better to identify what that TSB floor or that break point is for you, and then to cycle that each block. So the CTL will ramp up at a steady, fairly constant rate. Trying to kind of pinpoint those numbers, again, it goes back to some of those things that Gordo was talking about. Everyone is going to be a little bit different in terms of the ramp rate that they can handle or how quickly they can increase their CTL. If you hang out on the forums, you'll see 3 to 7 TSS, 3 to 7 CTL per week, which is pretty aggressive.
7 a week?
Yeah, 7 a week.
No way.
Yeah, so I mean, you do the math. That's what, from 0 to 350 a year. That's not advised. Don't try this.
Well, exactly. Remember, if you're going to try it, just remember when you cracked to see what did it. So you're saying 3 a week, 10 a month?
Yeah, it's 10 a month based on my experience is a good number. We're talking about going from 0 to 100 basically in a year. So within 2 years, you're talking about getting up to that level typical of cont qualifiers. 2 years of consistent, steady training where you're not peaking every other weekend and getting sick and doing all of those things. Be patient, not a patient, is a good quote from Alberto Salazar there. You don't want to do as much as you can. You want to do what you can absorb.
And that I think is where it helps to have somebody looking over your shoulder, because that patience is very tough when you're self-coached, or you just have the software look over your shoulder, and that's a nice way to do it as well. The other thing, 2 years, and just in terms of timeline, 2 years might seem like a long time, but even with the athletes that have the potential to get to that top amateur type shape, I mean, you really need to be thinking it's a 3 to 5 year campaign. 2 years would be very fast.
Yeah, so I mean, and that's really assuming one peak per year, and most people don't want to do that. Most people want to race more than once a year. So when you factor that in, then yeah, it extends things.
Okay.
So how do we raise CTL? Basically, the golden rule is that your TSS must exceed your CTL more often than not, and this is important not just in the short term, but also in the long term. So, rather than saying I'm going to go 50 above my CTL for this week and see what I can do, you've got to remember that you've got to do that for 5 months or so, an extended period of time. So, based on what I've experienced with athletes in terms of kind of round numbers of what they can handle, load weeks, 30 TSS per day greater than their CTL is a good number, good, fairly safe number for most athletes. So if your CTL, let's say 100, then doing your load weeks at 130 TSS a day, sort of 900 TSS a week, I guess, is that would be a safe number. And then, the opposite, the flip side of that is that the recovery weeks we want to be below your CTL because we want you to freshen up. We want you to shed some of that fatigue. So again, kind of looking at round numbers, 20 TSS per day lower than your CTL is a good way to freshen up.
And just for people that are going to apply this, how often would you recommend they're unloading relative to loading?
Yeah, every 3 to 4 weeks.
Okay.
So some athletes I'll have on 2 to 1 kind of load unloads, but most will be on 3 to 1.
The other thing is, and it's just if you find you're getting these unplanned unloading weeks, illness, things like that, or if you're finding you got to back off by say more than 20, that would probably be a sign that maybe the ramp rate's too high.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. And it's much better for your overall development to have a more gradual ramp rate than to be forced to take 2 recovery weeks. If you take 2 recovery weeks, you ditch quite a bit of fitness. If you take 3 recovery weeks, if you get really kind of run down, you ditch a lot of fitness.
Okay, and then coming back to the practical example, now the classic thing that we'll see is you get a weather window where all of a sudden you get fair weather in the spring or that spring camp. And what do? You hit it hard for 5 to 8 days, and then you have your scheduled recovery, but somewhere in there's a group ride or something happens 4 or 5 days into this recovery week. You go out, you smash yourself, and then you get sick, and then you're left with that 10 to 15-day recovery period. You dump a lot of load. The software will show you that that's costly, but in reality it's very costly in the real world of fitness and race performance. So you need, when it's time to unload, you have to have the discipline to unload. And a recovery week that is scheduled before you need it is far more valuable than one that's scheduled by illness or an overuse injury. And that's something that if you're self-coached, while you're thinking rationally and you're laying out your annual training plan, build those recovery weeks in and force yourself to take them. Because when things are going well, you'll be tempted to skip them. And to get that development that you need, you have to unload in those scheduled weeks. And it's great. It's phenomenal. Those, recovering when you're not ill.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes it's not even getting ill. It's just that kind of burned out feeling where you'll ask an athlete, well, you had 3 weeks there that were really light. What went on? And, they can't really point to anything. They weren't sick. They weren't especially busy at work. So stale. Not really digging it.
Yeah, a little too much trainer work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to interrupt you guys for a second. I know we're getting near the end of the hour, but there's some really good information that you guys have yet to cover. So we're going to go ahead and keep going. And if anyone has to drop off, we're going to have this webinar archived, so you'll be able to listen to the rest of it. So just wanted to make sure I put that out there.
Imagine that. You and me running along.
We went on again.
All right. Well, we can ramp it up. Okay.
Okay. So if you follow those prescriptions, it will lead to a CTL ramp rate of about 10 a month, which is what we talked about as kind of the safe ideal.
Okay.
So next chart shows exactly that. So it's showing we're starting from a CTL of 0 and we're loading at 30 TSS a day, which is at 0 plus 30. And you can see what happens to CTL when we do that. So within a month, we're at a CTL of 10. Within 2 months, we're at a CTL of 20, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of puts it into a little bit more of a practical perspective. All right, so on to the important stuff, which is a theme that keeps coming up. How to change your plan or adapt your plan when life happens. When you get sick, when you're stale, when you're a little busier at work, when you have a training camp scheduled. There's one of the guys we work with, Justin, has a really neat way of looking at Ironman racing, and he basically says, you have to expect the day not to go 100% according to plan. You have to expect things to come up. How many days over the course of a year do we have where everything goes according to plan? And if we look at that as an Ironman day, magnify that over a year. You've got folks who are writing their annual training plans at the moment, and they're planning 52 weeks down the road. And it's ambitious to think that the entire year is going to go right according to plan and nothing's going to come up that's going to force you to have to modify things. So it's important that when you are creating your annual training plan, that you do it with that perspective, that you don't have to get all of the details down now. It's much better to have a simpler plan that's flexible and easy to modify.
Yeah, be broadly correct and pay attention to stuff that screws you up, I think would be a key tip.
Yeah. So we've got John Claude here showing us what flexibility is all about. Yeah. Just looking at it. So yeah, a good plan must be flexible, not like John Claude flexible, but malleable and kind of responsive to the realities of what goes on in your life. So a simple strategy for having a flexible plan is to plan 1 month or one block at a time while keeping that big picture in mind. So we might say that, yeah, if everything goes, ideal and according to plan, that your CTL might go from 0 to 100 over the course of the year. But by the same token, we don't want to be fixed to that progression if something comes up over the course of the year that forces you to ditch some CTL.
And I think that's where your daily loading targets relative to where you finished the prior block can be very helpful.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's kind of what this next point, the next 2 points are about. If you look at your CTL, it will give you an honest appraisal of what your work tolerance is at that point. So, the Top Gun line where the commander says to Maverick, son, you're writing checks that your body can't cash. We see that all the time as coaches. You know, an athlete will have a challenging month. They won't get the training done. They won't have built that aerobic base to handle the next block, but they still want to push on. They still want to do that next block at the planned load. And that's exactly what it is. Their body is not prepared for that block, so you need to take a step back and you need to change things.
Now, practical tip there. So what it means is if you get to, say, March or April and you're behind, the thing that I tell people is you got to lower your targets. In other words, if you keep giving yourself too much, you're not going to pull back your season. And it's quite difficult to do, but you're going to get you'll see it. So if you feel like you're behind, nothing you can do other than back off, start hitting the appropriate targets, and then mentally it's going to be so much easier for you too, because you're not going to constantly feel like you're underperforming plan.
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind, you know, what I said about the CPL. Once it starts to take a nosedive, it's really, really hard to turn around. So, you know, you need to be conscious of that. When it starts to take a nosedive, take notice and change the plan accordingly. Okay, so
block.
Yeah, so basically we talked about going block by block, identify your CPL as you close out that block, and then plan the next block according to what your CPL actually is versus what you might have planned it to be, 3 or 4 or 5 months ago when you wrote your annual training plan.
And then with those TSS-based plans, which ones have you built up? What's there?
So right now in the store, I've got 3 sample plans, a swim, a bike, and a run, just for you to have a look at. But I've actually built a whole bunch of plans that look at different functional thresholds and different CPLs. So they take that advice and put it into a plan for you. So all you need to do is look at, okay, what's my current CPL, what's my current functional threshold, and you upload that plan.
Okay.
So there's all kinds of permutations there. You might have a really strong bike threshold and a really weak run threshold. You can just upload the strong bike plan and the weak run plan, and everything kind of progresses according to where you actually are versus where you hope to be. And yeah, we got a sample plan there at the very end, which basically shows that. So the way I've set it up is you can purchase swim, bike, and run plans separately and then overlay them. So as I said, your bike threshold you might be a big guy, and your bike threshold might be 400 watts, but your run threshold might be 10 minutes a mile. So that's not a problem. You just pick the plan accordingly, and you can upload. And I price them at $20 for each sport. So for $60 a month, you can have a fairly individualized kind of plan that really, short of hiring a kind of pretty high performance elite coach, it's a good alternative to that.
Okay. Thanks, AC.
You're welcome.
Just a little plug for our website. If you head over to endurancecorner.com, we publish Monday to Friday, and in the top right-hand corner of the front page, you'll find a little search box. And in our database, we've got over 1,000 articles. So if you've got a topic that interests you, you just go in, type it into that. You can see what all our columnists think about it. For our most popular articles, what we've done is on the menu bar on the left-hand side, you'll see that there's a library. And if you click library, all the headers will pop down, and our most popular articles are in there. Also, if you happen to have an article that you can't find, just use the contact sheet and send us a note if you want us to write about something. We've got a lot of different columnists, and we'll just pass that on to our editor, Nick, and we'll make sure that we cover it for you. Finally, Alan's got his email there. If you got something that you want to reach out or join Alan's wait list because you feel that somebody has a meeting of mind, you could do that. And if you just have a general question about coaching or something like that, feel free to reach out to me. Just use the contact sheet on the main website. So that's
Great. Thank you. Just a couple things before we get to question and answers. There's a lot of information here, and there's a great article that the guys mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, so I'm just going to show you how to get to it. It's called Power 411, and if you go to TrainingPeaks.com and you just type in Power 411 in the search box, you should be able to find it that way. This is an awesome place to start. It goes through a lot of the terms that Alan and Gordo used, and it's a really good place just to start getting some information on all of this. I also want to show you where you can access those plans that Alan was talking about. So again, if you go to our website and you go to products and you go to plans, and you may notice this looks a little bit different because we've done a pretty big site overhaul in the past couple months. But you just go to training plans and look at authors. And if you go to all authors, you'll be able to scroll down and find Alan's name. And from there, you can purchase those plans that he was talking about. So really good place. If you can't find them and you're interested, just shoot us an email into support. Or if you're going through and you're trying to set some of these things up in your TrainingPeaks account and you just need help on the feature, just contact us. So go to support, and on this main page, just click the Contact Us link. And just let us help you. That's what we're here for. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and read a couple questions for you guys. So the first question is, as a triathlete, would the hour of power be strictly an aero, bullhorn, standing, or all three? My coach had me do just 30 minutes. Is that not good?
Well, okay. You know, for these questions, your coach, I mean, we might do things differently, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're right. So I don't necessarily want to screw your relationship up with your coach. Your coach knows you better than we know you. But that said, your hour of power, you will have a different hour of power depending on the temperature, depending on the altitude, depending on how tired you are, depending on your position, depending on how well you slept the day before. So there's a lot of different things. So what I like to do is, if I'm looking at, you know, we're talking Ironman triathlon and we want a number that's going to be applicable, I want to see what your numbers are, TT position, flat, what can you produce? Most people will be able to produce more power going uphill, particularly uphill at sea level, standing on the pedals, but that's not going to be the most indicative number for taking to your training when you're doing your Ironman training and it's flat. So I would say you want to set your number specific to the most important type of training that you're going to be doing. And you're also going to need to know how heat, altitude, and these other things impact you so that you can adjust your training. For instance, I coach a guy that does a lot of training at high altitude, lives at sea level, which is where most of the testing's done, but goes to about 8,000 feet for periods of time in the summer where he will be training. So I need to adjust the power targets in particular for those sessions. AC, what would you add to that?
Yeah, no, really good points in terms of position, being position specific and specific to your location. Regarding the 30-minute question, the thing to realize is that athletes will differ markedly in terms of how quickly their power drops off as time increases. So if someone is using 30 minutes as an estimate, it's really important that they know for that athlete what the trend is and what's likely to happen at an hour. For instance, I work with athletes who will drop off 10% over that duration from 30 minutes to an hour. I work with others who will drop off 5%. So, that 5% is going to make quite a difference in terms of what number you come up with for the functional threshold. But 30 is certainly better than 20.
And for more on that topic that Alan just addressed, top right-hand corner of the Endurance Corner site, fatigue curves. And Alan's written a series of articles on that. You'll also find it in our library section under how to qualify for Kona. And it's an important thing to understand. The rule of thumb that you hear bandied about, double the duration, you're going to lose 5%. That's actually the best that we tend to see. Most people are much more than that. So just be aware of that if you're trying to apply a fatigue rate.
So that would be sort of freakish elite. That would, 5% is, it's unusual. So.
Yeah.
Okay, another question. For the CTL power slide that was shown, where most folks qualified for Kona with at least 130 CTL. How do those numbers translate to females who qualify for Kona? What is their CTL typically then?
I think the training load is quite similar, quite honestly. Yeah, it certainly doesn't drop off any for female athletes based on what I've seen. I mean, that said, I typically work more with guys, but you know, we have some very speedy females on the endurance Kona team.
Actually, if anything, it'd be higher.
Yeah,
higher. The female athletes that I coach, the elite amateur females, can do more than the guys. They can handle stress much better. And part of the reason for that is, remember, it's the metabolic cost. And large men have a much greater glycogen depletion. So what you will find is you'll find your older athletes, your less explosive athletes, your female athletes will be able to handle more stress under this system than the large young guys. And that's the way it is. So I would, you know, in particular, I've coached a guy who's been top 5 in Hawaii for a number of years. He won when he was 70, won his age group, and he can do Ironman bike splits at huge TSS numbers. And part of the reason for that is his intensity factor is very high, but it's high because the functional threshold's been coming down as he ages, but he's maintained his capacity to do the absolute work rate in terms of watts. Same kind of thing. If it's a smaller female athlete, she might not have a lot of threshold, but she will have, if she's a top elite amateur, she will have the capacity to operate at a very high percentage of that threshold for a long time. So the TSS would be higher.
Okay, great. We're definitely not going to have time to go through all these questions, so I'm just going to give you 2 more, and we'll do our best to try to get back to everyone who asked questions with answers down the line. But the next question is, do your CTLs include swimming? And if so, how do you calculate them?
Yeah. Yes, yes, they do. They do include swimming. At the moment, athletes have the choice of being able to use a couple of devices that can record swim metrics that they can then upload to TrainingPeaks to get a TSS number from the swim. So
what are the devices, AC?
The SwimSense and the new Garmin, I think, is also going to allow that as well, the 910. So.
And the SwimSense is compatible with TrainingPeaks. There's a few of us in the office that have it. We've been playing around with it, and a lot of us use it. It's pretty cool tool.
Yeah, you can see things like stroke rates, stroke length data, which is really, I mean, to be honest, 50% of Ironman triathletes have a swim limiter, so to be able to see those sort of technical metrics, it's a really handy piece of kit.
Great. So the last question is, if you are new to power training, would you suggest starting with normalized power for 60 minutes for STP?
Oh, I love it. Yeah. Okay. So new to power. There's actually an article on our site which is new to power, probably somewhere in there. And there's also, you'll see an archived webinar where Alan and I ran over on that one too, talking about how to get used to doing power. But the bottom line is, if you're new, resist the urge to do a ton of high-intensity training. What I recommend you do is do your normal training plan, download all the data into TrainingPeaks, and just watch the screen and learn how to do interval function, learn how to track your normal training. Don't go out and totally blast yourself. Do that for about 6 weeks, gather your data in, and get a bit of a feel for it. Then what you should do is, while you're doing that, read the Power 411 and maybe buy the book Training or Racing with Power, or if you're an Ironman athlete, you can buy my book Going Long with Joe Friel. You can read Alan's website and try and get a bit of a feel for what the key metrics are going to be for you. And then test with a reason. In other words, don't just go out and blast yourself and see what you can do. Have your testing part of a well-thought-out plan, or at least a somewhat well-thought-out plan. It doesn't need to be perfect. One of the mistakes I see a lot of people do is they go out and try and do CP5, CP12, CP20, CP40. You just blast yourself every second or third day to try and get this curve, this power curve. That's not necessary. Do your normal training and just learn how to track the data and use the tools would be my advice. AC, the question that I wanted you to ask is just related to this, is what do you think the most valuable test is for somebody that's out there and wants to get a feel for what their functional threshold is?
Honestly, I think that you get a lot more data if you can test frequently rather than testing maximally too often. So once you have an idea of what your heart rate ranges and markers are, once you know your aerobic threshold, your lactate threshold, those sort of numbers, those are relatively fixed. So you can then do submaximal testing and kind of infer up the curve a little bit, which is something that I do with a lot of my athletes. So we may do testing at, say, 150 beats a minute, which is significantly under their threshold, and then look at what the jump is relative to the last test and infer up the curve. And some people will say, well, that's crazy that you're not specifically testing. But we've only got so many hour time trials in each year, so it's much better to have up-to-date data than to have data that's 100% specific. It is something that I've found. So that's what I would encourage you to do. Get a sense of your heart rate zones, your heart rate ranges, and then look at what's happening with your power in each of those ranges and set FTP accordingly.
Sample set, just quickly, 3 by 15 minutes continuous, 130 beats per minute, 140 beats per minute, 150 beats per minute. Then ride easy for 5 minutes, repeat the main set with the same heart rate targets. Compare 15-minute power in each segment. Look at the max heart rate within each segment. That might be appropriate for an athlete that could sustain 160 beats per minute at a true maximal rested TT for an hour. It's a set I use a lot. It's very repeatable. It gives you a half-hour worth of threshold training, roughly, and it's a useful benchmark. You repeat the main set because you'll find that once your heart rate is elevated, you're going to get a much clearer picture on that second 45 minutes. Likewise, if you're doing longer aerobic tests, so you might want to do, say, an hour at 150 beats per minute, you need to look at 20-minute segments or 15-minute segments because the heart rate will progress. And ideally what you want to see is stable power, and then the heart rate settles in, and that'll give you a clear view.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, in terms of decoupling, your power will drift over time much more in the early season when you're not fit versus the late season. So you need to look at that in terms of interpreting those tests.
On that topic, just Google Friel decoupling, and Joe does there's a lot of charts and stuff. In his blog, you can see some nice practical examples of what we mean by heart rate power decoupling.
Great. All right. Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And if you are interested in any future webinars that we'll be doing, check out our support page. And in the personal edition, we've got a webinar schedule. So you can go there, keep your eye out on anything that we're scheduling in the future. And like I said at the beginning, we plan on putting together a webinar that goes through a lot of the features and a lot of the how-tos in the TrainingPeaks application and in your account so that you can start using some of the things that Gordo and Alan were speaking about. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close, and thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thanks.